Hello all, welcome to Aortic Hope's live stream. My name is Ryan. I am the Director of Genetic Education for Aortic Hope. And tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about Marfan Syndrome. As you may be aware, February is American Heart Month. So it's a time when really everybody should be focusing on cardiovascular health. In my opinion, the other 11 months of the year are pretty important as it relates to heart health as well. So, but we have chosen February as American Heart Month. And then also during the month of February, we also observe Marfan Awareness Month. So tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about Marfan syndrome. Last week we talked to Grace, who was phenomenal. She has Marfan syndrome, as does her father, Bill, who I believe is chatting with us next week. And so they've put me right smack dab in the middle of two actual experts who have Marfan syndrome. And so I have jokingly said no pressure. Although I am an aortic dissection survivor, I do not have Marfan syndrome, so that is not the cause of my aortic dissection. So I have a little bit of expertise in the matter, as well as being a genetic counselor. So I've been a genetic counselor for over 16 years, the majority of the time really focusing on cardiovascular genetics. And so tonight I plan on shedding a little bit of light on a lot of questions that you may have with regards to Marfan syndrome. So again, just a little bit of background on me. So I've been a genetic counselor for quite some time in the cardiovascular space. I was actually diagnosed with an aortic aneurysm. It's my aortic root that was involved when I was actually in graduate school. So I had already chosen genetics and loved it. I had no idea it was going to touch my personal life at the time. However, it definitely has. So I've had multiple heart surgeries, 2 open heart surgeries within the last 3 years. After I had a type A dissection in 2019. So I had been under surveillance for quite some time. For me. So again, tonight we're going to talk about Marfan syndrome. I'm going to go ahead and share my slide set with you here. I will have some time to answer some questions at the end. I will warn you that as a genetic counselor, for the most part, you'll see me maybe shy away a little bit from sort of the medical management questions a bit, because I'm not a medical doctor. And in anything I do say, to some degree, maybe take with a grain of salt, because your medical providers themselves are actually the ones that you need to be bringing those questions to, although I will do my very best. So again, tonight we're going to talk about Marfan syndrome. We're going to talk about some of the signs and symptoms of Marfan syndrome, the genetic cause for Marfan syndrome, as well as a little bit of information about management for it. We'll talk about genetic testing, although not in a lot of detail, because there's a lot of ins and outs of genetic testing where I could actually spend a ton of time talking about that as well. So first of all, I think it's important before we talk about details of Marfan syndrome, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page with regards to some different terms that can be used, some different terms that you may be hearing thrown around with regards to the genetics behind aortic disease. For example, the terms hereditary and familial sound like they may mean the same thing, and we kind of can use those interchangeably. However, in the genetics world, they mean something actually kind of very different. So, if you've been diagnosed with aortic aneurysm or dissection or rupture, or a loved one has, a very important question that probably a lot of people ask is this genetic? Are other family members at risk? What caused this to happen? And that definitely comes up if somebody is young, if somebody doesn't have other risk factors, like diet and lifestyle risk factors, that may explain why they have aortic disease. And so that's a very important question to ask, because it can impact management. It can impact management not only for the patient who's been diagnosed, but for those family members that could potentially be at risk. And so it is an extremely important question to ask. In general, what we have found is when the aortic root, so right where the aorta comes out of the heart, or the ascending aorta. So while it's still kind of traveling north before it gets to some of these other arteries that start to branch off of that, if somebody has an aortic aneurysm or dissection in that area of the aorta, it is currently thought to be very much a genetic risk involved. Whether we can find the gene through genetic testing or not, it is thought to be genetic disease. Whereas if we start to talk about the descending aorta, so once it is traveling back south, and this could include the chest, but more so when we're talking about aneurysms or dissections or ruptures that happen in the abdomen, that could have genetic risk factors involved, but diet and lifestyle tend to play a little bit more of a role there. And so there is kind of a difference between the two in terms of when we're talking about genetic or familial risks. So hereditary, we are generally talking about a single gene, one gene being passed down through the family, usually in a 50-50 type manner, associated with very high risk for the development of aneurysms or dissections. Versus familial disease, usually there are many factors involved, so it could be a combination of a number of genes, in addition to diet and lifestyle and age and smoking and alcohol and all of these other things that can play a risk or play a role in risk as well. So there is there's a pretty big difference between hereditary disease and what we call familial or multifactorial or many factors disease. So as I'd mentioned before, aortic root and ascending aorta tends to be more the hereditary single gene. And this can be passed down through the family, again, usually in a 50-50 type manner, but in a couple of different ways. So sometimes that risk for aortic aneurysm is part of a larger genetic condition, what's called a syndrome, where it involves risks for health issues in other areas of the body as well, not just the aorta. Maybe the most interestingly, and the reason I brought up the fact that I'm an aortic dissection survivor is because I'm going to plug in some personal experience here. But I am much taller than my parents. At the time when I was diagnosed, it wasn't known whether or not there were other aortic aneurysms in the family as well. I was the first one to come to medical attention with that. And significantly taller than my parents. I'm fairly tall and lanky. I've got horrible vision. I've always been very nearsighted since I was a very young age, and some other things as well that can be seen in Marfan syndrome. And through my journey, when doctors that I hadn't seen before would come into my room and instead of asking how I was doing, they really were quite convinced that I had Marfan syndrome, and I would spend the majority of my time not talking about my care and how I was feeling, but rather having to explain to them as a genetic counselor all of the reasons why I didn't have Marfan syndrome and that wasn't the cause for my aortic aneurysm and dissection. And the big reason for that was because I have some features of it. I don't have it, but I have some features of it. And again, Marfan syndrome really is probably the most well-known cause for aortic aneurysms and dissections. And so, it's really easy for medical professionals or people that really don't know all the intricacies of it all to kind of jump to that conclusion that, oh, you have aortic dissection at a really young age and you're kind of tall and you've got poor eyesight, and so it must be Marfan. And that's not always the case. It's much more complicated than that. But getting back to the educational piece here. So thoracic aortic aneurysm can be passed down through a family, sometimes part of a larger genetic syndrome. Marfan's not the only one, but again, as I mentioned, it's sort of the most well-known. There are others as well that you may have heard of. Loeys-Dietz syndrome, something called vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome can cause aortic dissections and ruptures as well. And then sometimes it's passed down through a family in the same manner, so still in a 50-50 type manner, but what we call non-syndromic thoracic aortic disease, not part of a larger genetic syndrome where you see other health concerns that go along with it. So it's strictly a 50-50 risk being passed down through the family for the development of aortic aneurysms and dissections. On the flip side of that, again, this familial or multifactorial, many factors, it tends to be more so abdominal aortic aneurysms, later age, lower risks to family members, although we can see a clustering of it with inherited thoracic aortic disease. Now, there are some families that kind of have a mixed bag of both. So when we see abdominal aortic aneurysms alone, we think many factors. But if it's in a family that is full of thoracic aortic disease, well, then that's probably related. And actually, going back to like graduate school, when I was learning about Marfan syndrome, we were kind of educated that, it involves the aortic root and the ascending aorta only. And as you'll hear from others, or as you may read online, there are a lot of patients with Marfan syndrome where they're only watching the thoracic aorta or the aorta within the chest, and they'll go on and have a dissection or an aneurysm develop in the abdomen, and they weren't even being watched for it, because I think that some may have a misconception that Marfan syndrome only involves the aortic root and the ascending aorta, and that's not true at all. Many patients with Marfan syndrome can develop issues with the aorta elsewhere, more distal or further away from the heart. So, okay, so hopefully the groundwork that I've laid kind of gets us all on the same page with regards to sort of an overview of genetics and aortic disease. These genetic syndromes that are passed down through a family that can cause aortic disease, they all act in a similar way in that they weaken our connective tissues. So just real quick, the term connective tissue, so we have connective tissue throughout our entire body. This is tissue that helps to support, protect, give structure and strength. It is important not only in our blood vessels, but our internal organs. Obviously, there's connective tissue in our skin and our bones. There's even a little bit of connective tissue in our eyes. And so as we talk a little bit more about Marfan syndrome, you'll see that there's connective tissue involved holding the lens of the eye in place. And so patients with Marfan syndrome have issues with that. And again, we'll go into more detail on that in just a moment. But as all of these conditions affect connective tissue, it's important to realize or understand that there's some overlap between these genetic syndromes. Sometimes a patient may fit into a category, fit into a specific genetic syndrome really well, where you wouldn't necessarily suspect something else. Yeah, I've seen some patients with Marfan syndrome who undoubtedly had Marfan syndrome. It wasn't anything else. But I've had some patients where I thought, perhaps this is Marfan, but they also have some characteristics or features of something that overlaps with Marfan syndrome. For example, Loeys-Dietz syndrome is something where we can see a lot of similarities. And so it's not a really straightforward thing, the diagnosis, all the time, but sometimes it can be. And so that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind as we talk about genetic testing in a few minutes, is that we may not always put all of our eggs in one basket as it relates to doing genetic testing. If we see a patient who we think may have Marfan syndrome, sometimes for cost reasons, it makes more sense to look at the genes that cause all of these conditions at the same time. Because what if Marfan comes back normal or negative and the insurance company says, well, you've already done genetic testing, we're not going to pay for anything more? It may have made more sense to actually cast the net wide and maybe look for a lot of these things at the same time. So it's especially important because, again, all of these conditions can affect the connective tissue, sometimes in different ways, but sometimes in very similar ways. And there's a lot of overlap between some of this stuff. So so it's not super straightforward, the diagnosis. And we're not missing anything as it relates to the management of the patient in front of us, but also their family members that may be at risk. And so that's kind of an important thing to consider. Let's see here. Some basic stats, not go into a lot of detail here, but just kind of some things to kind of keep in mind with regards to Marfan syndrome. It's currently thought that it affects probably about 1 in 5,000 people. Some of these other genetic syndromes, and maybe this is why Marfan syndrome is the most well known of them all. In general, it's thought that probably Marfan syndrome is the most common of those syndromes. Although as we learn a little bit more about Loeys-Dietz and realize that there are some patients who may not have all of those physical characteristics that can go with it, I do think that that condition may be in the ballpark of this is sort of the same incidence as Marfan syndrome, although we just don't know that number. But vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is another condition that I had mentioned. And that condition is much more rare. So I think one of the reasons why Marfan syndrome is pretty well known is just because, again, it in general is thought to probably be the most common of those. Now, about half of patients with Marfan syndrome, we estimate, don't know they have it. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of early diagnosis. But that's kind of a scary thing, because if someone knows they have Marfan syndrome, there's some things that we can do to manage their risks, and some preventive type things that we can consider. And so the thought that about half of people with Marfan syndrome are walking around out there, they don't know that they have it, and so they're not getting the appropriate genetic testing, they're not getting the appropriate imaging, they're not considering the medications that they may want to take, or they're not being watched for the health issues that they may develop over time. It's kind of a scary thing. And so that's why it's important to have an awareness month. That's why it's important for us to talk about this, to share this information that we know with others, so that we can maybe help to identify those that are at risk for some of these related medical concerns, and just aren't being watched by the right people, or aren't planning for some of the medical emergencies that they may face in time, and things like that. The 3 and 4 number that you see on the screen, 3 out of 4 people with Marfan syndrome have a parent who also has the condition. And so, I'd already brought up Grace and Bill. We chatted with Grace last week. Obviously, she has inherited this condition from her father, although, and I hope I'm not wrong on this, but my understanding is that Bill is the first one in his family with Marfan syndrome. And so then he would be that 1 in 4. 1 in 4 people with Marfan syndrome do not have a parent that they have inherited it from. And if you think about it, if something's been passed down through generations and generations, it had to have started somewhere. And so that's the way that some what we call dominant genetic conditions, where it's a 50-50 inheritance pattern. When genetic information is copied down from parent to child, picture sort of, handwriting a really large book. So let's say you've got a really large book and you're handwriting a copy of that book. You're bound to maybe make some mistakes along the way, and that happens. There's billions of letters of genetic information that are copied from parent to child, and sometimes some typos are made. Mistakes are made along the way, and our body does have a way to kind of go in and find some of these and correct them. But sometimes a genetic difference slips through the cracks, and a child may be the first one in their family with a genetic condition that then can be passed on to their child from there on out. So and that Grace has inherited that from him. So that's that 3 and 4 number. And then the 50-50 we've already chatted about a couple of times now. So Marfan syndrome is passed down in a 50-50 type manner. So if somebody has this condition, each of their children has a 50-50 chance. And that's an individual risk to each child. So let's say someone has had 2 children and both of them have inherited Marfan. It doesn't mean their next 2 children are going to not inherit Marfan. It is a 50-50 chance for each individual child that is born. So the importance of early diagnosis. It is important to know if somebody has Marfan syndrome, and there are many reasons for this. And I'm going to go through some of them here, but first let's talk about lifestyle and exercise. If somebody has Marfan syndrome, well, they've got certain risks associated with that. And we're going to go into the sort of the signs and symptoms here in a moment. But there are some orthopedic issues that can, get in the way of doing certain physical activities sometimes. And there could be some risk associated with that. And so certain types of activities may be avoided. This is more so than the orthopedic part. The heart part is very important, that if somebody has Marfan syndrome and has an aortic aneurysm, extremely important to consider what types of activities that person is doing. They shouldn't be lifting. Sometimes they shouldn't be lifting too much weight. There may be specific sports that should be avoided that would increase risk. Wouldn't want to be a race car driver or something where there could be potentially a high risk of a lot of trauma or impact to the chest. And so from a lifestyle or exercise perspective, there are some things that someone may do very differently if they know they have Marfan syndrome, and if they know that they have an aortic aneurysm, maybe some things to be avoided in order to lower risks. There are some specific medications. Historically, losartan was the big one. And again, not being a medical doctor, I don't want to go into too much detail. And if you ask me about dosage and things like that, I'm going to entirely avoid questions later on that. But losartan, beta blockers, these are all drugs that have been studied that may be considered in terms of perhaps maybe slowing, the progression of aortic disease. So maybe slowing an aneurysm from growing, because we know as an aneurysm grows and gets larger, the tissue of the aorta becomes weaker and the risk of dissection or rupture goes up as the aneurysm enlarges. So there's some medications that one may consider if they know that they have Marfan syndrome or that they know that they have aortic aneurysm. There is imaging that should be done. So we would periodically check in on some things, including the aorta, but also maybe the spine. Getting ahead of myself a little bit here, because we're going to talk about signs and symptoms in a moment, but we might start imaging the spine, and instead of waiting until there's a curve in the spine so bad that a surgery is required, perhaps we can look at maybe doing some bracing when the scoliosis or the curve in the spine is not so bad. And so there's lots of imaging, both of heart and other things that we may keep an eye on. I say keep an eye on, so also imaging the eyes, because one of the issues with Marfan syndrome is that the lens of the eye can sublux or become dislocated, and so we want to keep a close eye on the eyes for that issue throughout childhood and as somebody gets older as well. As it relates to pregnancy, we know that the volume of blood in the body, I think, doubles during pregnancy. So you might see higher blood pressures. Obviously, delivering a baby can be a pretty traumatic thing, and lots of things change in the body during the delivery process. And so someone with Marfan syndrome, if we know that they have a very large aortic aneurysm, may elect for a C-section, for example, in order to keep mom safe and baby safe through that whole process. And then another important reason for early diagnosis is just emergency preparedness. If somebody has back pain or chest pain, they may sometimes say, well, let's just kind of wait it out and see how I feel this afternoon. Not the case if you have Marfan, and if you have Marfan, or if you know you have an aortic aneurysm. You take those types of pains very seriously, and you try to get, if you think that it's that you've had an event where the aorta has torn, either a dissection or rupture, 911 ambulance, get to the hospital as soon as possible. So that was the case with me, is that I knew I had a very large aortic aneurysm. And so the second that I dissected, I knew exactly what had happened. The ambulance was here at the house, and I was off to the hospital and was under the knife getting surgery to repair my aorta pretty quickly. And it's because I knew exactly what had happened. And so that's, part of the importance of early diagnosis as well, is being prepared for those types of emergencies. So here's where we go into a little bit more detail about Marfan syndrome itself, and I think I had mentioned earlier that, and if not, you'll hear it again here. So there were so many times that people were. I did say this already. So there were so many times that people were convinced that I had Marfan syndrome along the way, and being a genetics professional, I knew I didn't. And so, it's understanding how this is diagnosed and understanding that some people may meet some of the criteria to the point where you say, well, how is this not Marfan syndrome? And that was the case with a lot of my doctors, is that weren't as familiar with the subject. You've got a young person in front of you who's got some features of Marfan and has an aortic dissection at a very young age. A lot of people that don't know that there are other genetic causes for aortic dissection may say, oh, you got some features and you've got aortic dissection, so it must be Marfan. The diagnosis, it's especially for those that don't do this stuff kind of day in and day out, can be a little bit complicated. And I've had a number of patients who were proven to have Marfan even though they didn't meet the diagnostic criteria. And then I had some people along the way who were very close to meeting the diagnostic criteria, where we thought this must be Marfan, and it ended up being one of these other conditions that overlapped with it. Myself, I've got a number of features of Marfan syndrome and the aortic dissection, and they just weren't able to find the genetic cause for what I'm dealing with, and why I have not only some of these other symptoms throughout my body, but especially the aortic dissection at a young age. And we know it's genetic because my dad and his two sisters all have aortic aneurysms as well. We found after the fact, but none of them are kind of tall and lanky like I am. And so those things were sort of kind of led us astray a little bit, where we thought this is part of maybe some kind of genetic syndrome for me. And it turns out that whatever reason I have for being taller and lankier than everybody else has nothing to do with the fact that there's aortic aneurysms in our family. So mine is probably one of those ones where it's part of something that's not a genetic syndrome. So diagnosing Marfan syndrome, the way that we do that has changed a little bit over the years. It definitely involves more genetic testing than it did in the past, but we look at kind of three main categories. So the heart, and specifically whether or not the aortic root or the ascending aorta is enlarged, is one of these three. When we talk about the eyes, we're specifically talking about whether or not the lens of the eye is impacted by this. So if we see a subluxation or a dislocation of the lens of the eye, and interestingly, if somebody has dislocated lenses and aortic root that's enlarged, there's really not much else to explain that outside of Marfan syndrome. So if you've got those two things, you meet the criteria for Marfan syndrome. And then the third area is the body. So these are some of the other signs and symptoms that we can see. I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time on what's called the thumb and the wrist sign here. And the reason for that is I've had so many patients referred to me over the years where the referral note said, well, they've got the thumb sign and the wrist sign, and so we think they must have Marfan syndrome. And then they would come into clinic and they didn't remotely have the thumb or the wrist sign. So I'm going to spend just a second on that. The wrist sign is that you can wrap your thumb and then your pinky finger around the opposite wrist. However, the key here is that the thumb needs to overlap the pinky at least to the end of the nail bed on the pinky. So it's not a matter of them touching or maybe overlapping a little bit. The thumb has to overlap all the way to the end of the nail bed of the pinky. That said, this is pretty common. So if I were sent someone to evaluate for Marfan syndrome because they're tall, a lot of these tall, thin kids that would come to me, basketball players and whatnot, they all had a positive wrist sign. So that's really not super uncommon, especially in a tall, thin person, to have a positive wrist sign. As I hit age 40, I started to put on some weight, and my wrist sign is still positive, even though I don't have Marfan syndrome. So that one, we take a little bit with a grain of salt. But the thumb sign, however, is less common. Now, the problem is, though, a lot of people don't do this correctly. And so a lot of people are told, oh, you got the positive thumb sign, and they actually don't. So when you're doing the thumb sign, you can't fold your palm in half. That's cheating. I can really get my thumb over there if I fold my palm in half. This is not a test of flexibility. This is a test of how long are your fingers. And so you got to keep your palm nice and flat and then bring your thumb across your palm. And it actually has to go beyond the side of your palm. At least that first knuckle on your thumb has to be beyond the side of your palm without folding your palm in half in any way, shape, or form. So you would need a very long thumb in order for that to be positive, and that is much more rare. It doesn't mean you have Marfan syndrome if you've got a positive thumb sign, but so many people were sent to me with a positive thumb sign who didn't even come close in the end once we actually did the evaluation correctly. Patients with Marfan syndrome can have differences in their chest, where it either caves in or sticks out like a pigeon chest. This is called a pectus. And there are two types of pectus, carinatum and excavatum, depending on whether it sticks out like a pigeon chest or caves in. There are some differences in the feet, so we can see very flat feet. A lot of patients that I saw with Marfan syndrome over the years had to have surgery on their feet because they had no arch to their feet, and when they would stand, it would just meld into the floor, and they had a lot of pain associated with that, and so they would have surgery on their feet. And then there's something called a hindfoot deformity, a little bit tough to explain, but this has to do with the angle between the ankle and then the way that the foot kind of sits below the ankle. So there's a big angle there that we can measure. As I mentioned before, patients with Marfan syndrome can have pretty significant scoliosis. With Marfan syndrome, we count the scoliosis if it is actually a 20-degree curve or greater. So that's a pretty big curve that usually requires some kind of bracing or surgery. And so if somebody has a bit of a curve in their spine, scoliosis itself, especially mild scoliosis, is not all that uncommon. And so it has to be to a certain degree before we really count that. Patients with Marfan syndrome tend to have stretch marks, oftentimes even though they're very thin. And this is sort of a reflection, perhaps, on differences in their connective tissues in their skin, but also just the fact that they have grown very quickly. And so I hadn't mentioned it yet, but we see tall and lanky, arms, legs, toes, fingers, the long bones in the body in somebody with Marfan syndrome tend to be a bit unusually long. And so that's where we get to, some of the ratios. We do some measurements where, the wingspan is not only greater than that person's height, but has to meet a certain ratio. And so it has to be actually pretty significantly longer, the wingspan, than the height. And then we do something called an upper to lower segment ratio. So this takes into account the fact that the legs are longer than the torso. But again, not just longer, but pretty significantly longer. And so we do all of these math ratios. We'd already talked about the eyes, although one of the body characteristics that we consider is nearsightedness. So that has nothing to do with the lens of the eyes being dislocated, but just tend to have very poor vision and be very nearsighted. And we'd already talked about the heart, but one of the body findings, so we got to separate a couple of heart things out here. One of the body findings is mitral valve prolapse, so a problem with the mitral valve in the body. And then finally, and there are a couple of other things that are a little bit more unusual that we haven't mentioned that require a bit more imaging. But one of the other things that we can really easily assess is whether or not someone has the facial characteristics of Marfan syndrome. So this is eyes that slant down. This is very flat face, so not a lot of cheekbone, kind of a long face. The roof of the mouth very high, and so not a lot of room for teeth, and so we see a lot of dental crowding. And so these are some of the facial characteristics. And so with regards to the body, there's a scoring system that we use. Some of the lesser, some of the least common findings are sort of awarded more points than some of the things that are a little bit more common. So as I mentioned, the wrist sign, if somebody's tall and thin, the wrist sign is almost a combination of the wrist and the thumb sign, then we're talking 3 points. And the cutoff is at 7. So 3 out of 7 is quite a long ways towards meeting the criteria for your body. And we've only taken into account the lengths of the fingers at that point. So, so that's a pretty big one. But so there are points, and we add them up, and so really to get a what's called a clinical diagnosis of Marfan syndrome, we're talking 2 out of the 3, and those 3 things then are having a body score of 7 or more. The aortic root or ascending aorta is enlarged, and then the lens dislocation of the eye. So 2 out of those 3 will get a clinical diagnosis of Marfan syndrome, although we really need to also look at family history. So if somebody's mother or father had Marfan syndrome, our threshold to say a child has inherited it is obviously a little bit lower because they're already starting out at a 50-50 chance. We're not talking about a 1 in 5,000 anymore because their parent has it. And so our threshold to say this person has Marfan syndrome is a little bit lower if we know mom or dad has it, obviously. And then genetic testing is now very much incorporated into that as well. So I specifically, I remember one family that just didn't meet criteria for Marfan syndrome with regards to the body findings, and their eyes weren't really involved with regards to the dislocated lens. So we knew that there were aortic aneurysms in their family, and their bodies were kind of similar to mine, where I've got a few features of it, but I don't reach the score of 7. But we did genetic testing, and they were found to have typo or a mistake in that gene that we know causes Marfan syndrome. So it's the FBN1 or fibrillin1 gene. And they had a typo in that gene. And so even though they didn't meet the clinical criteria, we knew that that was truly Marfan syndrome and not something else. And so that helps us to provide the right kind of management for them. On the topic of genetic testing, when we do a genetic test, we're not looking to see if somebody has the Marfan gene. We all have that gene. That gene plays a very important role in our connective tissues. And so for most people, those without Marfan syndrome, that gene is working properly. So there are no problems with that gene, no typos in that gene. And so they don't have Marfan syndrome. So when we do a genetic test, we're not looking to see if somebody has that gene. We're looking to see if there is a typo or a mistake in that gene that makes it so that gene is not doing its job properly. In other words, not providing that strength to those connective tissues that we need. So that's just a little bit of background about what we do when we do genetic testing. We're looking for genes that everybody should have, but we're reading those genes and looking for any spelling errors or typos in those genes when we do that test. So moving on to the subject of tests, we talked just now a little bit about genetics, genetic testing. If we suspect somebody has one of these conditions, then, it may be important to do some genetic testing, and not only in terms of figuring out or making sure that we're providing the correct sort of management to that person, but if we can find the gene involved, we can also sort out who in the family has inherited those risks. In other words, who needs to be followed closely for some of these health issues versus those who have not inherited that risk and who just don't need to worry about that condition, even though it's in their family. If they've not inherited that genetic typo, then their risks are not 0, but they are now that of the general population, and they don't necessarily need to be getting these echocardiograms every year or anything like that. So speaking of echocardiograms, when we're talking about imaging, and I've chatted about this already a little bit, but a couple of areas. So imaging the heart could involve echocardiograms. So they may do an ultrasound of the heart through the chest. I have had a number of these, and they're not the best experience, but if they need to get a little bit closer look at a valve or something, they may actually put a camera down the throat, something called a transesophageal echocardiogram, where they can get a little bit of a better picture. And then things like CTs and MRIs are done pretty frequently as well. An echocardiogram is a very good test for monitoring things on an annual basis. They usually don't incorporate CT scans or MRIs unless somebody is maybe getting close to that threshold where they might want to consider doing preventive surgery. In other words, repairing an aneurysm before it has an opportunity to tear. Or if someone has already had those surgeries, either preventive or because they had an aortic dissection, oftentimes they'll be doing CT scans or MRIs, usually CT scans, in order to take a look at the graft to make sure that everything looks good after surgery. But CTs and MRIs are technically a better image or a better picture, but one can have pretty good peace of mind if they're getting an echocardiogram every year, and if things look good there. It is still a very good test. If someone has had some progression of their aneurysm, so if it's grown a little bit from one year to the next, they may do a CT scan or an MRI in order to get a little bit more of an accurate measurement to see if it truly has grown. So now, otherwise, in terms of imaging, again, there's a specific exam that they do for the eyes called the slit lamp exam, SLIT. A slit lamp examination is good at looking at the lenses of the eyes. And then we may be talking about X-rays or MRIs as it relates to the bones and looking for some of these orthopedic issues, or maybe soft tissue differences in the spine or something like that. You may get an MRI. So when we talk about imaging, for the most part, we're talking about the heart, but there are some other imaging tests that may be done as well there. There is a lot of information on the internet, lots of resources, lots of websites with information. I caution people to be a little bit careful because there is misinformation on a lot of websites. There are a lot of people out there that are seeking to make money from certain supplements and things like that. So you really got to be careful about the information you're finding online. I would add also that there's a little bit of a bias in terms of who's online telling their stories. And so there are some folks who are living with Marfan syndrome who really don't necessarily have a lot of these like orthopedic issues, or maybe they might be, monitored for a lifetime and never have an aortic dissection. The folks that are getting online and telling their stories, a lot of times are those that have had a lot of struggles. And so you might see a little bit of a bias in that direction, where if you get online and do a lot of reading, it can lead to sometimes a little bit of unnecessary anxiety related to that. So, I say this just to be careful, but, a very good source of information, not only for Marfan syndrome, but they've kind of branched out and are kind of helping lots of families with all of these genetic syndromes, as well as those that have, again, the non-syndromic aortic disease as well. But marfan.org is a fantastic source of information. Everything on there is accurate, and they have some support systems in place too for patients that have these conditions. And then Aortic Hope has been just a godsend for me to be able to touch base with others, others that are also like around my age that have had aortic dissections, who have had second or third heart surgeries like I have had. And, I can't encourage that more to chat with others and see what types of struggles they've faced. And everybody can provide encouragement and tips and tricks and all sorts of things that have helped them along through their journey. And so, I am a big fan of sort of limiting the number of resources that you go looking for online. And I would say, number one, to avoid misinformation, but number two, just to not be so overwhelmed by everything that's out there. But, if I had to list two websites or two sources of information and support that I would go to every single time, it is Marfan and Aortic Hope. So those are fantastic resources, and I can't encourage you enough to go check out some of that stuff that's online at those two websites. And so finally, I'm going to open things up a little bit for some Q&A. Again, my disclaimer is I'm not a medical doctor, and so I may entertain the idea of answering some specific medical questions, but I'm going to be very careful about that. And even if I answer your question or say something about that really you need to go and chat with your doctors specifically about specific medical questions. But at this point, Josh, if we can get this opened up, then I'm going to stop sharing my screen
For
and
sure.
we'll
Thank
open
you,
this up
Ryan.
for some Q&A.
Right
Yeah.
on. First things first, let's say hi to Bo. He's our one of our longest subscribers. We love it when he comes to say hi. And for the audience, can you show me the thumb test? You were in a smaller window, so we couldn't really see your hand. So if you could just
Yeah. And actually, so herein lies the problem. I stopped sharing and now I got to try to find my way back to where I can see the video again.
Oh
So
no,
I'm
no, I
bigger
can
now.
see. Yeah, I can see you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, actually, yep, and I see my little self, but so if I'm big on your end now, um, so you may not have seen it in the small thumbnail, but thoracic aortic disease is not necessarily related to being extremely bald at a young age, but here I am. Um, so it is the thumb sign specifically that we wanted to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If because you said your wrist, you put it like that's not you're not gonna be able to demonstrate that.
Well, yeah, I
Well,
mean,
not
it's
so much
tough,
demonstrate it,
and
but it'd be a successful test, is what I'm saying. Like you don't have the
it
Marfan.
probably would.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have Marfan. I may still have a positive risk sign. It's close. I've put on a couple of pounds, Josh. Um, so so with the
Oh,
risk
I
sign, again,
see.
it is
Yeah.
thumb and pinky, but the thumb needs to be able to reach the end of the nail bed on the pinky.
Okay, now
So
you're
if I
leaning with
squeeze
your
real
head.
hard,
There you go.
yeah. Oh
Yeah, you
wait,
got to
nope.
do some
It's
jujitsu
focusing on
on
my,
yourself right there.
yeah,
That's it. Okay, so I
yeah.
see what you're
It's
saying.
focused. Yeah, and I can get real close. I'd probably cut off circulation at this point.
Hmm.
But thumb needs to reach the end of the nail bed
Yeah.
on the pinky for the wrist to be positive. But that's pretty common.
Okay.
Again, I'm only 6'1", so I'm not ridiculously tall. I'm fairly tall. Um, but up until maybe about 2 years back, when especially during the winter when I'm not going out for jogs, the risk sign is not as positive as it would be if I'm taking a couple of pounds off. The thumb sign.
Hmm. Hmm.
So here is why it's always positive when people would refer patients to me, and then they would come to me, and I'd say, "No way, is that
They would
positive?"
squish their hand.
You can't fold the palm in half.
Yeah.
You're cheating. That's more like flexibility of your connective tissues, but this is solely a test of how long your fingers are and your thumb is. So you got to keep your palm nice and flat and bring it across the palm.
Okay.
Okay. And so patients with Marfan syndrome, their thumb will extend a bit beyond the side of their palm, at least to that first knuckle.
Hmm.
So I can do it if I cheat, right? So that's beyond the first knuckle, but it is giving me some pain. So it's literally keep your palm flat and put your thumb across. And I've
Okay.
got pretty long fingers. I'm a piano and guitar player, so I've got pretty long fingers, but the end of my thumb doesn't even, you know,
Yeah,
go
yeah,
beyond the
exactly.
edge
And
of my
I wanted to
palm.
be able to
And
illustrate that for the audience.
unless I cheat, right?
Yeah,
So that's the difference. So we don't cheat,
exactly.
especially because if we're talking the body score for Marfan syndrome, having the wrist and the thumb sign gets you 3 out of 7
Hmm.
points. So we don't cheat on this stuff because this is life or death diagnosis potentially. Uh, we want to get it right. So that is how we appropriately do the thumb sign, which I do not have obviously.
No, but that's crazy flexibility anyway. Okay. Molly Thomas says, "Howdy. I'm not Marfan or any of the others, but I find this very interesting." We love Molly. Oh.
I do not know Molly yet, although I'm fairly new. I've been around a couple of months, but working on getting a little bit more involved here. But thank you, Molly, for watching tonight, and I hopefully that this information was beneficial. And I'm starting to submit some blogs, so we're going to talk about on Aortic Hope's website more than just Marfan moving forward. So I'm starting a series of, of blog posts for Aortic Hope that will address some of the individual syndromes, but also how thoracic aortic disease can be passed on through a family without being part of this, and all these things that I kind of chatted through tonight, as well as genetic testing, insurance, billing, genetic discrimination. A lot of those questions I'm going to kind of tackle those subjects a little bit here one at a time. So thanks for joining us anyways.
Yeah, yeah. I especially liked how you explained the way they're looking at the genome itself, and you were like, everybody's going to have this. The question is whether or not there's any errors or inefficiencies
Yeah.
inside of it, right? And I think even
Yeah.
that cleared it up for me because I was like, oh, so it's not like an added thing that people have. Everybody has it, and these are incorrect somehow. And
Yeah, some of these phrases that are thrown around, you hear those phrases a lot, like "Do I have the Marfan gene?" Well, yeah, you do. We all
mhm.
do. So it's good to kind of rephrase that to kind of think about how they do those tests and what they're actually looking for, because out of our 20,000 or so genes that we have, I mean, for the most part, we do all have those genes. It's just a matter of whether or not those genes are working properly.
Okay. And if somebody were to go through with the genetic testing, how like what can you explain to happen? Is there like anything? Is it always spit? Is it always like a 3-week turnaround? Like, what are some of the parameters to expect?
Sure, sure. So with genetic testing, there are a few different ways that we can get the test taken care of. So in general, just because it's less likely to fail, we do like to do a blood test. So you would end up going to a lab and having blood drawn. However, other types of tests are just as accurate. It's just a matter of whether or not the sample was good enough to test the DNA. So we can do a cheek swab or a spit sample, what's called a saliva sample as well. And those tests are just as accurate, but the lab does need to first test that sample to make sure that they've gotten enough DNA that they can accurately do the genetic test. Also, unfortunately, sometimes people pass away and they may be the first one in the family or the only person that had the condition that we can test for these genes. And so we talk a little bit about post-mortem genetic testing, where perhaps the medical examiner can save some tissue. And there are some specific details about how they're able to do that, either store some blood or get some tissue that we can do a genetic test on. And that's a little bit more nitpicky if we're talking about someone who is alive with aortic aneurysm or who has survived a dissection and doing a genetic test. Lots of ways we can do that: blood test, cheek swab, saliva test.
Okay. And the turnaround usually?
Yeah, so in general, about 14 days or so.
Okay.
Every lab varies, but in general, we're talking a couple of weeks. Um, if there was some medical reason to have to need to get it done faster, um, you know, sometimes so the insurance won't pay for it to be done faster. Usually, that's usually like an out-of-pocket expense where you can get expedited testing and get a result back a bit faster. That's more important for a child who's born who is crashing and having seizures, and they need to
Mm,
figure out what the condition is so that they can provide the right supplements or provide the right medication to save the baby's life. Not as much, usually an issue in cardiology. But yeah, 14 to 21 days. Usually they'll actually start the process of isolating the DNA and the things they need to do before they can actually start reading the DNA. Usually they'll start that process before they've even gotten insurance determination figured out and all of that stuff. So it really, the amount of time it takes for insurance to approve or deny, all of that stuff doesn't necessarily slow down the process. So generally, yeah, we're talking 10 to 14 days.
okay. Yeah, that's good to know. Whenever you're going to undertake something like this, you always want to have an idea for what's going to happen. So Molly's got a great question. She says, "Are there any celebrities with Marfan?"
There have been quite a few. Um, I think so. Most recently, the person that comes to mind with regards to aortic dissection, although he didn't have Marfan syndrome, it wasn't the cause for his aortic dissection, was John Ritter. I've seen no reason to believe that he had a specific genetic syndrome. Historically speaking, the person that comes to mind all the time is Abe Lincoln. And interestingly, so I worked at our hospital.
Oh, hold on,
And
Ryan.
I'd
Hold on, Ryan.
heard all yeah,
You blanked out there
I
for
am
just
very
a few
dark.
seconds. Interestingly,
Well,
when it comes to Abraham Lincoln,
yeah, and also I grew dark because I switched to a different tab, and that I've got a monitor in front of me that's brighter. So,
yeah.
Marfan syndrome has been brought up a lot for Abe Lincoln, And I worked in cancer genetics for quite some time, and I've done about a bit of reading on that. He was tall and lanky, um, but he had a lot of like lumps and bumps on his skin and stuff too. And so I wonder if he had maybe a cancer condition where he had maybe a tumor that caused him to have too much growth hormone, and maybe that's why he was kind of tall and lanky, because all of these lumps and bumps on his skin and stuff that you see in photographs makes me think that he had something called multiple endocrine neoplasia, or MEN, as opposed to Marfan syndrome. So not everybody who's tall and lanky has Marfan syndrome, and I'm a little bit skeptical about whether or not he did, but you'll find that all over the internet. And then the other person, the reason I clicked on a different tab on the computer in front of me and everything got dark, I was trying to look up his name. It's Vincent. Oh, I cannot think of his name right now. He was the long and tall um, ghost in the subway on the Patrick Swayze movie with Whoopi Goldberg.
Oh.
I think it was called Ghost. He was, he was on the subway, this real tall, lanky guy. And actually, if you were to look him up, I think it's Vincent something. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But his facial characteristics are really textbook
Okay.
as it relates to Marfan syndrome. So if you want to look and see what types of, but again, that's textbook. And I've seen lots of folks with Marfan syndrome who didn't have the textbook facial characteristics. But if you want to see someone who's kind of got the whole checklist of what somebody's face with Marfan syndrome looks like, again, he kind of played the scary ghost on the subway in the movie Ghost, that he had really all of those facial characteristics that we see with that.
Okay. Is it safe to assume that the tallest person in the world has Marfan?
No,
No.
not at all. So, so here's something really crazy. So it's my ex-wife. I'm remarried, but my ex-wife's great uncle was in the Guinness Book of World Records at 8'3",
What?
and yeah, that's I would hope he could dunk. I'd imagine he probably wasn't super athletic though. Um, but he didn't have Marfan syndrome. So a lot of like the super tall people have a problem with, maybe like a benign tumor on the gland that creates growth hormone, and stuff like that. And it really comes to be a concerning thing if you're talking like NBA basketball players that are super tall. Some of them have been actually identified as having Marfan syndrome sort of during the pre-draft process. There was this guy, I think he went to Baylor. Last name was Austin. A couple of years back, who actually I think now tours a little bit and answers questions about Marfan syndrome, but he ended up not going pro. And now I think he may actually, I think they're watching his heart pretty closely, but I think he ended up playing some basketball in Europe. But a lot of people who are tall, and this came up all the time when I was in clinic, that pediatricians would send this tall lanky kid to us, and we think he has Marfan, and he would have like a body score of like 1 or 2, no family history, normal echo. We'd come to find out, well, dad's 6'10" and mom's 6'4", so of course he's tall. Not everybody who's tall has Marfan, and not everybody who has Marfan is tall. So that's why we got to look at all of these other details as well.
Okay. When we were talking to Grace about her eyesight, it seemed like she was suggesting that it was a rapidly degenerative situation.
So and again, if I'm not mistaken, I think the lenses of the eyes are involved in Grace's family a bit. So you can actually get a surgery where they put in a lens that's, I don't know what material they use, but they put in a non-native lens into the eye to help with vision as well. But even folks with Marfan who don't have the lens of the eye involved tend to be pretty nearsighted. As am I though. So I don't know if you know like about optometry, you've got like the negative numbers, the number of diopters, it has to do with your prescription. I'm at a -7. So if I take these glasses off, I don't care how big this monitor is in front of me, I'm not going to be able to read a single letter on it. And I don't have Marfan. I just have poor vision in my family, and unfortunately as well, and male pattern baldness. So, so it's everybody with Marfan is affected differently, and
Hmm.
some have it very mildly in some areas of their body and more severely in others, and vice versa. Um, the eyes are not always involved. It's very different for each person. Yeah, even within the same family. So a parent might have the lens issues and the child doesn't.
Wow. All right, Ryan. I think that's excellent.
Okay.
Feel like you
Okay.
nailed
Very
everything. Is
good.
there anything else you have to shout out
I
something? I hear you have a new gig.
Yeah. Well, I got a lot more to say, but probably not necessarily tonight. I do owe you a Survivor Series video pretty soon, which I'll be doing.
Eagerly
And then,
awaiting.
like I said, yeah, yeah. And then, like I said, I'm starting a blog series about kind of all things genetics. Although I think with us observing Heart Month and specifically Marfan Awareness Month, this was a good place to start, I think.
Right on. Okay, so hold on. Let's see if we can answer a real quick question. It's kind of on the side
Okay.
here. Have you explored the Chat GPT situation at all?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm a huge tech nerd.
And now,
Yeah,
are
I'm
you
using
using this to write some of these blogs?
Okay, so no, although it is a great so I've got a very much an ADHD mind where it's kind of difficult to get started on a project,
Uh huh.
but once I kind of lay down the groundworks, then I fly. So I have been using it to write outlines to just kind
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
figure out the order of topics that the order in which I'm going to approach things, and then I do a lot of the writing on my own because I've had it try to write things. I'm like, okay, so that's not the tone or the language that I would use. But in terms of initial outline, it's a fantastic tool, especially considering I usually will like sit there and stare at a screen for an hour before I get started. Now I can get started right away because it does what is the biggest barrier for me. It gets me started in writing my outline, and then I just roll with it.
Right, and I agree with that. Here's the thing, right? The my estimation on the way this Chat GPT thing is going to start to really hammer things home for people who aren't using it yet is I do like the idea that you're using it for layouts and getting you started, but like it does great HTML and great JavaScript,
Oh, for sure.
right?
Yeah.
And
So I also
so,
I also do some coding and yeah, I also like graphic design stuff. So Midjourney is an AI tool that's really cool for like doing some graphic design. It's all phenomenal. It's like great for productivity, but you got to be careful and make sure that uh, that you're using it appropriately because it
uh-huh,
it
uh-huh.
does have its weaknesses yet. Um, and but it's great for someone who like me who has a hard time just to get started, like it gets
Sure.
me started and then yeah, so it just it's cool. I think it's very exciting.
Well, what I was gonna say was, even if it's getting you started, the idea that you can take it and just start editing it, right? Like think about the
Yeah,
big chunk of something that you can get started when you can start dishing away things. Oh my God, I'm so in love
yeah,
with it. I'm so in love with it. It's ridiculous.
yeah. Oh, it's been
Uh,
my,
Molly
my daughter
says,
every day is like, you love AI, don't you, dad? Yeah, I love it. It's
yes.
awesome.
Molly says, we're so fortunate to have you and your genetic expertise. And she's got a big winky face there. You'll
Awesome. Yeah,
recognize Molly at the
I'm
next meeting.
happy to be here. Okay.
You will. You
Very
will.
good. Yeah, no, I'm so happy to be here. Like I said, from a support perspective, I put it off too long. I needed to seek support long before I actually did. And so that was great. But, now to start to give back, I left genetics because, I was just the amount of empathy that I was feeling for patients. It was just hitting a little bit too close to home after I'd had my third heart surgery, almost died a couple of times. Like I said, I'm going to get my story out there to you soon. But so I left genetics and took about a year off. This is just a kind of a great way to kind of get back into things a little bit and not only help others, but everyone's providing help to me too. So it's just been phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the reciprocation for sure. All right. Well,
Awesome.
thank you, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Oh, that's the thing
Right?
you told me to say, and I didn't say. Hit
It's
the little
okay.
like button, hit subscribe. Uh, Check out all of the content that's available and all of the content that is to come.
Right on. All right. Let's go ahead and sign this bad boy out. Thanks again, Ryan. You've been
Very good.
fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.
Yep.